Hello and welcome to Chess Please, and today we are talking about strategy in chess, and more specifically how to make a strategic plan in chess. I'm going to share with you 3 tools that I use every single game to help me make a plan, for better or for worse, but definitely for more fun. So you may find yourself in the position of having learned how to play chess, learned how the pieces moved, learned some key concepts like developing your pieces, controlling the center, defending your pieces, keeping your king safe, all of the basics that can kind of get you started and stop you losing every single game within a couple of moves. And you can play thousands and thousands of chess games like that with those basic building blocks, and you can get really good at chess with just those basic building blocks. And I'm not disparaging that, but I think playing like that is a missed opportunity to learn about and practice the most fun and rewarding element of chess for me. For me, making a plan, seeing it come to fruition and win because of that plan really butters my bread and keeps me coming back to the chessboard every day. So we're going to get started with 3 tools that you can use. The first one is concerning pawns, the second one is concerning your pieces, and the third one about your opponent's pieces. Let's jump right in. So my first tip when it comes to making a plan is to look at the pawn structures on the board, and specifically your pawns will predict your plans. Now what do I mean by that? What I do first and foremost, in the middle game or just after the opening, there will generally have been some pawn oddities created, either doubled pawns, pawn weaknesses, or different functions of pawns that have happened. That is how I'm going to start to form my plan. Now, what do I mean by pawn weaknesses? If you're unfamiliar with pawn weaknesses, I've outlined them in pretty comically clear terms here in black's position. I've left white's position pretty pristine at this case, like it's one solid chain going all the way across the board. There are some like nominal weaknesses which I'll touch on in a second, but all in all it is like a super strong pawn chain. There's no real gaps in the armor. Whereas if we look at black's position, there are 3 kind of very well known pawn weaknesses outlined here in black's position. The first one is doubled pawns. Now doubled pawns are kind of what they say on the tin. It's where you have 2 pawns on one file as a result of a capture that has taken place there. Now the problem with doubled pawns is not only do they, this defender is taken away from this pawn, so that's one less defender it's ever going to have, and also this pawn is never going to have itself to defend itself. So they're inherently like 1 pawn weaker defensively because they're only ever going to have this pawn defending one of them. They're also never going to be able to move as fast as other pawns because for every square forward up the board, like this pawn in particular is going to have to wait in traffic to move up the board. So they're very, very slow. They're pretty cumbersome. They're not the worst when it comes to pawn weaknesses. They'll happen probably every single game, and in the center of the board, and if they're well defended by other pieces, they're pretty fine. But it's just something to file away. If I see double pawns, particularly look at this back pawn, and particularly look at the square in front of the double pawns, maybe you can like lodge a piece there to really slow down and clog up your opponent's position. So that's one thing that I look at to see, okay, where are there some double pawns that I can maybe attack the back pawn, or I can plonk a piece in front of it that's going to have a pretty safe life there and slow down any sort of like air that they want to generate in their position. The next weakness I want to talk about is backwards pawns. So a backwards pawn is this pawn here, where we have both of the possible defenders of the pawn in advance of the pawn itself. Now backwards pawns can be temporary weaknesses because obviously we know that this pawn can move forward very quickly, but as it stands right now, this pawn is incredibly weak because it's never going to have another pawn defending it until it moves forward again. But the main weakness actually with backwards pawns, where you have this sort of setup, kind of a V going up the board, is if we were to plonk a knight in here, that knight is so secure because you're actually going to have to trade off a piece, another knight or a bishop, or like maybe worst case scenario a rook, to get that knight out of what is an absolutely juice fest of a square. Like it's got serious control over black's position here, and there's no pawn that's ever going to be able to oust it. So a backwards pawn is another like big sort of red flag moment to say, okay, backwards pawn, the back pawn of the V, definitely weak, but the square in front of that back pawn is like so soft, and if you can land a piece in there and then like start to defend it yourself, you're going to have an enduring competitive advantage for the rest of the game. Now What you might be saying to yourself is, yep, that all makes sense. The back pawn is weak and the square in front of it very weak. But given that I've said like, oh, white has a really nice, pawn structure here. They've got one pawn island compared to black has 3 pawn islands here, 3 separate like units of pawns. Like, doesn't white also have a backward pawn here? And the answer is yes. That is a backwards pawn. It doesn't have another pawn defending it. These pawns, if one of them were ever to move forward, I think they're like kind of backwards now, but I think it's more if one of them moves forward, they would become backwards pawns. Which brings me to an important point about this, because you might say like, oh well, don't you create a pawn weakness with every single pawn move in that case? And the answer is yes, you do. You weaken something every single time you move a pawn. Because they can't move backwards, you create a permanent weakness somewhere on the board. Now, a natural conclusion from that is, if every time I move my pawn I create a weakness, maybe I just won't move my pawns ever again. See how that goes for you first and foremost. But it also brings me to a point on strategy, which is, it's not a case of like never having doubled pawns or never creating a backwards pawn or an isolated pawn of your own. It's about like, they are weaknesses in your position, and you can't really make any progress in one area of the board without creating a weakness on another area of the board. But that's the resource management side of chess. You both start with the same amount of material. You will move your pieces, hopefully in a coordinated fashion, to focus on one area of the board, or you can again focus on a broad spectrum of the board, but you're still going to be creating weaknesses somewhere. And if you can coordinate to exploit your opponent's weaknesses and kind of put your own weaknesses on the back burner or outside of the kitchen of the game, basically, that's where strategy can really come into effect, where you minimize all of your weaknesses and you maximize all of your opponent's weaknesses. So we have double pawns, we have backward pawns, and then the final one is isolated pawns, again for kind of the same reason as a backward pawn, given that an isolated pawn, i.e. where there's no pawns on either side, is never going to have another pawn defending it. So another trigger for a plan for me is, if I see an isolated pawn, if I can create an isolated pawn in my opponent's position, then that can become the focus for all of my attacking efforts. And that might seem strange to say, like, yeah, but it's just one pawn. Like, why would you focus all of your attacking efforts on winning just one pawn? But I think the pawn should be seen as kind of like an aperture or an opening into black's position or into your opponent's position. If you can laser in on one specific pawn with all of your pieces, that pawn is like likely going to fall if you maneuver your pieces correctly and you are able to put enough pressure on there. And in the falling of that pawn, you're probably going to open up your opponent's position, and all of your pieces are going to be in and around there to start flooding through and attacking your opponent's king. So one pawn, yeah, it's probably not worth all of your time, but it's a really good way to start your plan, to start to coordinate your forces, to get them all in the same ballpark, staring at the same part of the board, building pressure so that, like, ultimately to bring about a collapse of the whole position, just like a wedge in the door of black's position. So that's why I focus on pawns as my first port of call when I'm, out of the opening, moving into the middle game, and I'm like, okay, well, what do I do now? I've developed my pieces, my king is safe, there's no like immediate threats or captures or checks. What's my plan? I look at the pawns and I say, oh, I see they've got an isolated pawn here. Let's start to maneuver our pieces that way. Which brings me on to my next piece, which is about activating your pieces. Now, these next 2 tips I'm going to cover in one fell swoop because they're kind of the inverse of each other. So when it comes to strategy, the other part of forming a plan, apart from looking at pawn weaknesses, is activating your own pieces and burying your opponent's pieces. So a huge part of strategy is making sure that your army is in a position to take advantage of different weaknesses in your opponent's position. So that is why development and getting your pieces into happy homes is such a big part of chess and such a big part of strategy. If you spot weaknesses in your opponent's position and your pieces are miles away, those weaknesses don't really matter. It's like those weaknesses I talked about earlier where you're just bound to have some somewhere, but if your opponent can't exploit them, they're not real weaknesses. So developing your pieces to happy homes, i.e. activating your pieces, is one of the best things that you can do to stack the deck in your favor. And that's why it's a strategic maneuver, because it's not necessarily, placing my knight here is going to result in this specific tactic or this specific fork or anything like that. But it's by owning that piece of land, by dominating that square and making sure that your knight stays there, you are stacking the deck that something like that is going to happen, or that black can't do certain things that they might want to because the knight is there, because if they did, then the fork would occur. So all of these kind of like depth of thinking things are very big in strategy. So making sure your pieces have happy, unencumbered homes. And honestly, it's just good for morale if your pieces have good homes to stay in. So in this board here, I've drawn out a very kind of crash course in what are some of the happiest homes for pieces. This is going to vary based on position. But the most obvious one here, I think, is the knight sitting in front of one of the isolated pawns that we talked about earlier on. It's got no other pawns to defend it and help kick out this knight. And also the knight is backed up by another knight and a pawn. So it's going to take a fierce amount of jimmying from black's position to try and get him out of there. And inversely, if we look at black's knights, we see that this knight is on the rim, which we know to be grim. It's got very few places that it can go. Now, this knight isn't the worst, but it's not a happy home for it. It's going to have to maneuver out here, and maybe here, and like again, sorry, from here to like here. It's not an absolute disaster, but it's certainly not necessarily where you want to be developing your knight, unless you have a really specific concrete reason to. This knight, again, also not the worst in the world, but positionally wise, it's blocking in two of its diagonal operators, and it's also pinned by this bishop here, so it actually can't move until the queen does, which might give it us time to maybe lock down this square might want to go, or any number of operations we want to get involved in. So some shocking knights here for black, and some absolute beauties here from white. Now, moving on to the bishops, we see that black's bishops are probably the least active that you'll ever see. They're both hemmed in by their own pieces, which is the worst place for your bishops to be. If they're hemmed in by opponents' pieces, you can start to work on that. You can start to maneuver that a little bit better. You can even think about sacrificing if it gets really dire. But you can't take your own pieces. And if I just keep these pieces here, I'm under no obligation to take this pawn. And I can keep this knight here forever, which basically just locks this bishop out from this diagonal forever. So again, the bishop might come out here, but we have this diagonal blocked as well. So this bishop is living a sorry life. Similar again to this bishop. Can't really move here until the queen does, until the knight does, which is an aeon of time. And even when it does, again, staring out here, that's one of the weaknesses in our position, is that a pawn. But it's not really in the kitchen of the game. There might be something for black to try later on, but they're just way too far behind in development. So we see two of the worst bishops in the world, whereas we see our black bishop, or dark square bishop I should say, is cruising here in a very active position. It also has avenues back here and here and here, so even if it does get a little bit jimmied by these pawns, there's things that we can do to keep this alive, and worst case scenario, it ends up here on a nice long diagonal. So it's really not the end of the world. Probably, again, this is maybe one of black's only ways out, is by trying to jimmy that bishop out, but we have a stranglehold on black here. And then this white bishop, not all pieces can be, as Daniel Naroditsky would say, distributing the COVID vaccine or pulling up trees in your position. But this bishop, as probably maybe our worst piece, still doing a great job. Still got an eye on this rook x-ray wise, still keeping this bishop under lock and key. Also maybe willing to trade it off for that knight there, should have jumped into there. So not our best piece, not our worst piece, but one of the most active places for this white light square bishop to be. Now, moving on to rooks, we see that our rooks are on an open file that we have control over. There's no other rook opposing us. We also have some like discovery ideas if any important piece, say her, comes onto the square. We wouldn't go there, but maybe we go here or something. So we have complete dominance over this c file, and this is where we're really going to kind of start shoveling through. Again, this is like fairy tale nice position. This is more just to show you where your pieces are happiest. So rooks are happiest on an open file, and they're extra happy when they get to play together. Doubled on a file is probably most likely where you're going to see them. But if you ever are lucky enough to double them on the 7th rank, piggies on the 7th, or the 2nd if you're playing as black, they are happy as pigs in muck, as they say. So rooks playing together on open files where they can cruise around the board, that's their happiest place. So look for ways to get your rooks there so that you can implement, a strategic plan to attack a weakness because you have so much activity to exploit those weaknesses. And again, we look at black rooks here. Not rocket science. This rook literally has no legal moves and is absolutely hemmed in. Something's gone desperately wrong for black in this game, but that's fine. And then this rook again, not the absolute worst. A lot of rooks find themselves in this position, but no real job prospects for this rook anytime soon. So it's looking pretty dire. So with queens, because they're so versatile and so powerful, oftentimes hanging back and supporting the other pieces in the early salvo with the attack and then coming in to mop up at the end is where queens want to be. Now this queen isn't the worst. There could be kind of a more, you know, dramatic place for this to be, but actually looking at it, like, it can't go here, and if it comes here, we do have some knight maneuvers and things like that. But it's not like completely hemmed in. I think probably the worst home for a queen is like in an early attack, if it takes like one of these pawns and we can start to think about trapping it. That's probably the worst home for a queen. This queen, beautifully placed in my mind. It's defending this, it's defending this. It's kind of holding everything together. It's not like front and center, but once the detritus starts to clear from the board a little and a few of these soldiers die, then the queen is going to have a lot of room to operate in and is defending a lot of our pieces already. So it's going to be very well coordinated. And oftentimes you'll see the queen for the early part of the game on this second rank, on this seventh rank, on maybe a diagonal supporting a bishop or supporting a piece like this, and allowing the rooks to connect, whether that's along the first rank here or allowing them to actually buddy up and double on a certain rank. So that is in general where your pieces want to live. Your bishops on open long diagonals, your rooks on open files, preferably buddied up together, your knights in the center in outposts, places where they can only get traded off by other pieces, and oftentimes they also like to buddy up as well. Knights defending each other, it's often kind of a nice elegance. So making sure that as you're developing your plan in the early stages of the game, you're getting your pieces into happy homes, so that when you spot double pawns, a backwards pawn, an isolated pawn, even maybe an open file, a complete lack of a pawn, that you can fully exploit that weakness. So, too long didn't read. Once you get out of the opening, look for pawn weaknesses in your opponent's position. That could be doubled pawns, that could be backwards pawns, or isolated pawns. The next step, develop your pieces to happy homes, i.e. where they have the most activity, where they can roam about the cabin as much as possible, and try to do things that limit your opponent's pieces to some of the most unhappy homes that they could ever find, blocked in by their own pieces, pinned to their own pieces, just don't have a ton of squares in which they can move to, and you'll really restrict your opponent's play, giving you time and space to exploit some of those pawn weaknesses and then flood on through when you capture that piece. That is, as I say, a far from exhaustive list on strategies. There are libraries and libraries of books on how to employ strategies in chess, but I find that the pawn predicting plans thing is probably the most important part of this. Is that's where you can use as a hook to say, right, there's a pawn weakness, let's all pile in on it, and then let's flood through that weakness. That's my take on things. Would love to get your take on how you tackle strategy, how you employ strategy in games, and if there's a thing or two I could learn about doing it myself, because, as I said, it is so fun when a plan comes together. That is all from me, folks. Feel free to subscribe and stick around. You'll make my day, and you'll get some extra chess content like this. And do let me know if there's any types of videos that you would like to see, as we're always cooking up new stuff in the lab. Thanks very much. All the best.